Hello and welcome to Lecture 11 of History 362, African American History. Today I'm going to be talking about the quote-unquote New Negro. This is a 20th century phenomenon based in new kinds of research, new kinds of writing, new kinds of ethical propositions about what it means to be African American in the 20th century. And I'm then going to be talking about Marcus Garvey, who often gets omitted to a certain extent from African American history, despite the fact that his organization was the largest organization of African American members of its time. All right, so to explain what the quote-unquote New Negro was, all kinds of scholars working in the 20th century began to study the Black community and to take action in various ways, some ways through the courts and sometimes through setting up infrastructures of their own. So I'll give you some examples. The National Urban League in the 1920s was led by Eugene K. Jones, who was a social scientist and a graduate of Virginia University in Richmond, and it took up many civil rights causes in the 1920s. The Urban League led boycotts of businesses that refused to hire African Americans and pressured city schools to provide training for workers. The organization maintained affiliates in more than 30 cities, including some in the South, where it attempted to eliminate barriers to unemployment, ensure fair treatment for workers, and improve housing and sanitation. The NAACP, which we talked about the founding of in a previous lecture, worked with the Urban League. Both were reformist and both were progressive organizations, but the Urban League did not seek a mass membership in the same way that the NAACP did. The NAACP at this time in the 1920s was headed by James Weldon Johnson, who you can see at right. He was the first Black executive secretary of the organization, and right away when he took charge, he went to work on a nationwide membership campaign. You could join the NAACP for $1 a year, and this campaign resulted in the organization becoming overwhelmingly Black. Throughout the 1920s, there were more than 300 chapters nationwide, including some chapters in the Deep South, although those chapters were the subject of anti-Black violence, and so they ended up having to close or go underground. The NAACP claimed that it had 100,000 members, so it was a large organization, although, as we're going to see, not as large as the organization founded by Marcus Garvey. The NAACP in the 1920s used the court system to challenge housing discrimination and looked to Congress to end lynchings. In Buchanan versus Worley, the organization convinced the Supreme Court to overturn city ordinances restricting where African Americans could live. They also successfully defended the Black physician Ossian Sweet from murder charges after his home was attacked in Detroit in 1926 and he fought back. And the NAACP also backed the Dyer anti-lynching bill, which would have backed, I hope I said backed rather than blocked. The bill would have made lynching a federal crime, but the bill was not to become law because Southern white congressmen overwhelmingly voted against it. So as African Americans began in this time period to have academic positions in universities, they started studying issues of interest to the Black community, like, for example, the cause of interracial violence. At right here, you see the sociologist Charles S. Johnson. Johnson did a really in-depth study on race relations in Chicago, and so he pioneered the notion that social scientific research should back racial equality and integration legislation. He became the chair of the Social Sciences Department at Fisk University. This is also the period in which W.E.B. Du Bois left the NAACP to accept a position at Atlanta University. And James Weldon Johnson, who I showed on the previous page, became the chair of creative writing and literature at Fisk. More than any other individual, Carter G. Woodson pioneered the serious study of African American history and culture. He was an educator who received a PhD from Harvard University in 1912. Then he began to teach at the M Street High School in Washington, D.C. He established some journals that were important, including Journal of Negro History and the Negro History Bulletin. The main scholarly journal in the field was the Journal of Negro History, and the bulletin was mainly to circulate the results of research to educators and students and general readers. Woodson also established the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And in 1926, he created Negro History Week, which became Black History Month in 1976. So the study of African Americans really came into its own as a field in the 1920s with a lot of impulse or motivation from Carter Woodson. Another famous African American scholar, Arthur Schomburg, collected 5,000 books, documents, and other materials pertaining to Black history, and his collection became the basis for a research center. It's called the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and it's at the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library. All right, now we're going to move on to, within this very scholarly milieu of the 1920s, the guy who really started the most popular, most influential organization for African Americans in the late teens and early 1920s. Okay, just to foreground a little bit about his importance, there are a couple of different strains in the history of African American civil rights. One of these is integrationism, which was the strategy pursued by the NAACP, that African Americans should integrate into existing American society and work and live and study alongside white Americans, and that would be the answer to racial struggles and problems. A second strain that will later be associated with Malcolm X and the Black Panthers was for the Black community to rely on its own efforts and businesses for uplift, to maybe practice some separatism, and Marcus Garvey is one of the earliest examples of a leader in the later tradition. Garvey was born in Jamaica in 1887. He was the grandson of a slave, and he was apprenticed to a printer while he was a young man. But he got fired from his printer job by helping to lead a strike of the printers. And after that, he really had a hard time getting a job. So he moved to Costa Rica for a while and then to London, just really trying to find a place where he could be a quote-unquote race leader. He had read Booker T. Washington's biography, Up From Slavery, and he decided that he had what it took to be a similar kind of leader for Black people. He decided, when he moved back to Jamaica in 1914, to form an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which did all kinds of things to try to advance the cause of Black unity. They printed tracts, they sponsored lectures, they were very anti-colonialist at a time when European powers still had their empires. But the problem about trying to form this kind of progressive organization in Jamaica and being as dark-skinned as Garvey was is Jamaica had a very strong, firm caste system based on skin color. And The lighter-skinned African ancestry people were very much more respected than the darker-skinned ones. And a fully black person like Garvey was automatically low status. And nobody who was light wanted to be called a Negro. So the Universal Negro Improvement Association was not a title that was going to appeal to high-status Jamaicans. So he struggled along a bit in Jamaica and then decided finally in 1916 that what was really going to be best for him was to move to the United States and try to foster his organization there. So he moved to Harlem in 1916. I will talk more about Harlem in Lecture 12, but note that it had become a mecca for black people due to the Great Migration. Most were from the South. Some were from downtown Manhattan, but had moved north because it was safer. And interestingly, about a quarter of the residents of Harlem were from outside the U.S., many of them from nations of the West Indies where there were no official segregationist policies. So West Indians moved to Harlem being unused to the notion of segregation, being unused to the notion of Jim Crow, and they were some of the most vociferous, loud voices for black civil rights in the 19-teens. Okay, well, at first, Garvey really couldn't get very much of a following, so he traveled all around the South, trying to get a good idea of the problems faced under Jim Crow. When he returned, he became one of the most avid street corner speakers in Harlem. Harlem had a lot of people who would stand on street corners and sort of preach and sort of give their political ideas to listeners and bypassers. He met a black socialist orator by the name of Hubert Harrison, who gave Garvey the opportunity to be his sort of warm-up act when Harrison addressed large Harlem crowds. But Garvey had an incredible, powerful voice and was such an eloquent speaker that he soon became the main attraction. Post-war American racism made Garvey's organization and message attractive to working-class black people. He revived black nationalism and separatism, and his movement was a grassroots movement that attracted membership among African Americans in rural and urban areas all over the U.S. Now, part of what they were doing was providing services. The UNIA conducted voter registration drives, established health clinics, started adult night schools, lauded Africa's greatness, called for free and independent Africans. Because like W.E.B. Du Bois, Garvey believed that Pan-Africanism, that is the oneness of all African peoples, no matter where they were born, whether they were from the U.S. or from Africa, was the key to overcoming racism. Garvey encouraged Black Americans to embrace their African identity, to envision their international connections to other oppressed Blacks, and he was among a group of Americans who went to the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I and tried to push the idea of self-determination for African countries. Just to give you a little parenthetical aside, this was just at the time when the powers who had participated in the First World War but had lost, their colonies were being farmed out under the auspices of the League of Nations to other colonial European powers. And so the notion was that some of these countries would quickly get independence, would quickly revert to being ruled by the actual native peoples who lived there, but other areas of the world would have to wait. And Africa, which had been carved up into many, many little pieces by European powers, was looked down upon by the great powers at the Paris Peace Conference, and they thought, oh, Africans will not be able to take care of themselves for a really long time. So Garvey and others were there to push the notion that, no, if self-determination was going to be a thing for European countries, for the Slavs and the Czechs and people who had new countries carved out of the empires of Europe, then Africans indeed ought to be in charge of their destiny as well. On the right-hand part of the slide, you can see a wonderful picture of some of the members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association standing in front of their boarding house. They ran a boarding house. They also had a restaurant that they owned. And their really impressive uniforms, and Garvey there with the cape on in the front row. And that brings up the fact that Garveyism had some rituals and symbols that it used to communicate prestige and captivate his followers. He, as I showed you a moment ago, had people dress in uniform and hats and with bands and banners, and they paraded through Harlem. And a lot of this language and ritual came from societies that were older, like the Black Freemasons. They had a very complex leadership hierarchy. They had grand titles. They had strong women's auxiliaries. And Garvey's own inspirational rhetoric and sharp dress and proud self-presentation attracted lots of followers. All right, so Garveyism was a pretty ritualistic kind of movement. It also was very good at getting its message out, ultimately, because in 1918, Marcus Garvey founded a weekly newspaper called the Negro World. It was one of the most popular newspapers in the late teens among African Americans. It entered a market where there were already 400 African American owned and run newspapers and journals. The Negro World started with a circulation of 3,000 subscribers, but by 1919 the paper had 50,000 readers, and by the early 1920s it had 200,000 readers. It had a popular women's page that was edited by Garvey's wife. And it's interesting that Garvey was willing to take support and patronage of his newspaper, even from people that he disagreed with. One of the most famous and definitely the wealthiest Black woman in this time period was somebody named Madam C.J. Walker. She had started a real business empire based on the sale of hair straightening products for African American women. Now, the notion was that hair that was straight was, quote, good hair, and hair that couldn't be straightened or was natural was, quote, bad hair. And Garvey, as somebody who was a very proud believer in Black identity, didn't agree with this notion. But Madam C.J. Walker had made a huge fortune selling beauty products, and she was willing to help sponsor his newspaper. So he was willing to ignore how she made the money and take the money and go on and support the newspaper. In 1920, the UNIA held a convention at Madison Square Garden in New York City. It was preceded by a grand parade with marching bands and choirs, and Marcus Garvey and the president of the African country of Liberia dressed in their finest regalia and traveling in an open sedan. 45,000 people attended this convention, at which Garvey was crowned the provisional president of the African Republic, even though there was no African Republic at that time, but, aspirationally. And the convention adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. Now, this was a kind of thing like the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen that the United States and France had produced in the 18th century. And it called for Africans everywhere to have the right to define themselves, to practice self-determination, to be free from segregated societies like Jim Crow. By 1921, the UNIA had about 4 million members. That is a huge number. I want to call your attention to the advertisement on the right for the Black Star Line, Let Us Guide Our Own Destiny. That will give me a good segue into the next slide. At the heart of Garvey's message was a separate black economy and independent black enterprises. The organization established not only hotels and restaurants, they also established stores under the general rubric of what was called the Negro Factories Corporation. The problem in terms of the long-term financial stability of the Negro Factories Corporation was all the money just got put in one big pot from all the different enterprises, and the money got funneled to whichever business was doing badly. And so that meant that, it was basically going to be a losing proposition. It's interesting to note that Garvey's companies made, among other things, dolls in various shades of brown, ranging all the way from dark to very light. Garvey condemned integration, as I said, and one of the things that was a little bit dubious about him from the perspective of, let's say, the NAACP was that he had the same ideas about racial purity and racial pride that were put forward by the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, Garvey believed that pure racial strains were the best, and he theoretically believed that mixed people were inferior to pure, unadulterated people. And this was the kind of stuff that the KKK believed in the 1920s. He met with the leader of the Atlanta KKK to try to broker an agreement that said he wouldn't oppose Jim Crow publicly, and the Klan would let UNIA representatives come to the South and encourage black people to move to Africa. He was thereby opposed by many middle-class African Americans. The Chicago Defender portrayed him as a cult leader. W.E.B. Du Bois opposed Garvey's leadership and message and called him, quote, the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and in the world, and said that he was either a lunatic or a traitor. Garvey, in turn, distrusted light-skinned leaders like Du Bois, so there was no love lost between the two of them. As I mentioned a moment ago, here is Garvey at right in his open sedan with the president of Liberia as they are proceeding to the Madison Square Garden convention. Garvey decided in 1919 that what he really wanted was to encourage people to move to Africa, and he wanted to unite Africans in Africa and African Americans, and he wanted to create a transatlantic travel line, shipping line that was going to be fully staffed and funded by black people. He called it the Black Star Line. It was meant to be sort of like a sarcastic retort to the fact that the White Star Line was the most posh transatlantic passenger ship company then operating, but black people were not really allowed to ride on the White Star Line. So he set up this steamship company. He sold all kinds of shares in the company for $5 a share, and contributors could have their names listed in the Negro World newspaper. By 1922, the Black Star Line had sold more than 150,000 shares of stock and had acquired 3 ships, but the 3 ships were in really bad condition. They traveled very slowly. They were not capable of going on a long ocean voyage. Garvey also had trouble fully staffing his ships with people of African ancestry, so he was hiring white engineers and captains for his ships, sort of going against what his original plan was. Over time, the Justice Department grew suspicious of Garvey. They had been, the forerunner to the FBI had been investigating him for a few years and not really moving on him or doing anything. But in 1922, he was charged with mail fraud. In 1923, he was convicted of mail fraud, even though he really, he didn't do what he did on purpose. He was selling shares of stock. He was representing that they were going to found this company, and the fact that the company wasn't super financially solvent was not making it a pyramid scheme. It was just the fact that he wasn't really good at running a shipping company. He was convicted, as I say, and in 1925 he began serving a 5-year sentence in an Atlanta prison. It's interesting to note that while he was in prison, he still gave speeches and interviews. He served as the nominal leader of the UNIA from prison, and he also lobbied for an early release. Well, he got his early release in 1927, but he was immediately deported as an undesirable alien since he was not a U.S. citizen. Garvey and his wife went to Jamaica to live, and the UNIA kind of failed over time without him. An interesting side note. After his deportation, Marcus Garvey got very interested in the country of Ethiopia, which in the 1930s was led by Emperor Haile Selassie, whose birth name was Tafari. He started to see Haile Selassie as kind of a messianic figure who was going to usher in an age of nationalism and peace for Black people as the leader of Ethiopia. Unfortunately, Ethiopia was invaded by Italy in the mid-1930s. There was a big war that the European countries mainly stayed out of, and the Europeans, Italians won that one. But Tafari, or Haile Selassie, still was seen as kind of a messianic figure, and this morphed into the Rastafarian religion, in which Marcus Garvey is still remembered as a kind of prophet who foretold the coming of Rastafari. Garvey died of a stroke in 1940, and Garveyism, despite its huge impact during the late 19-teens and early 1920s, was mostly forgotten about until the Black Power movement of the 1960s and the rise of many independent African republics. He is still a polarizing figure in the historiography. Some people see him as a kind of savior of the Black community. Other people see him as a charlatan. But I don't think we need to think of him either way. Rather, he was the embodiment of the desires of Black Americans to have another solution to the problems of Jim Crow America. You know, that maybe the problems seemed too big to fix, and so the idea was to go to Africa. But, you know, he really did embody some of those other ideas about Black nationalism and self-determination. Okay, see you in the comments.